it's 5.3, how form mirrors content. Analyzing and evaluating form and structure in poetry. The lesson objective is students will be able to analyze and evaluate form and structure in poems. So I want you to take some notes here. Our first question is, what is form and structure? And I have a couple of images to help you understand the difference between the two. Form we can think of as a silhouette, and structure we can think of as an X-ray. So let me tell you a little bit more. When you're thinking about form, first of all, what is form? It's the overall shape or type, including established types like sonnets or haikus. And we're not going to spend a lot of time investigating these types of poems, sonnets, haikus, other forms that have specific rules in them. We're looking more at modern poetry that doesn't fit a particular type or form. But what you can look at when you think about form is the overall view of a poem like a silhouette by asking questions like this. How does the poem look visually on the page? How many stanzas are there? How many lines? Are any lines, words, stanzas isolated? And are some lines longer than others? What patterns do you see? So those are all some good questions to ask with form. With structure, we're thinking of an X-ray. So we're really looking into the poem. So we're going to define it as the organization of the poem itself and how the lines and stanzas are arranged. So when we're talking about structure, we want to ask these kinds of questions. What is the poet's focus of attention? How is the poem organized? Where are the transitions or changes from one idea to the next? How is it divided up? What's the focus of one stanza versus another stanza? All right, how about some key terms about form and structure? Oh, I love this one, enjambment. Do you know this one? It's a great one, enjambment. It is the running of a line over into the next without a pause. So that means without punctuation. And end stopping is our second term. It's the opposite of enjambment. It's ending a line of poetry with punctuation. So the typical way to end a line of poetry is to end stop a line, to conclude the line with punctuation. So if you look at the poem that we're looking at today, Disaster in the Eye of the Beholder, this is the first stanza. And it reads like this. I used to live in a single wide, tilted on blocks in a dusty trailer park, or as the sign that said to trucks that rumbled by, a much more respectable mobile home court. So we can, you can see that there are some lines without punctuation, or that are ended without punctuation. So 2, 4, and 6 are ended without punctuation. So what do we say about those? We say that they're enjambed. Or we can say there is enjambment in lines 2, 4, and 6. Or we could say the lines spill over. They don't end but continue on into the next line. 2, 4, 6. Lines 3, 5, and 7, however, are end stopped. We have the comma in line 3, comma in line 5, and the period in line 7. So those lines are end stopped. Line 1 is unusual because single wide is a word that's broken in half. And so we have the dash there that shows single wide is an adjective describing a trailer. So what kind of a trailer is it? It's a single wide trailer. And we don't have the word trailer in here, we just have single wide. But it's kind of unusual because it's a word actually broken in half. This dash isn't signifying what dashes typically signify, moving into a different thought or, pausing to make some kind of parenthetical aside. Instead, it's just half of the word. All right, so Key terms, more key terms, irregular line breaks. Line breaks are a key term, just knowing what they are. But looking for irregular line breaks is a really good thing to look for in modern poetry. The fancy word for punctuation in the middle of a line is caesura. It's a strong pause in the middle of a line, usually punctuation somewhere other than at the end of a line of poetry. But if you don't want to have to remember that fancy word, you can just think of them as irregular line breaks. And there's an irregular line break between lines 1 and 2 because the comma after wide comes after the first word of the line. And the word single wide is split between 2 lines. That's what I was talking about a moment ago. All right, how about isolated words? Here's another good term to know when we're analyzing form and structure. Isolated words are isolated on the page either by line breaks or by punctuation, and sometimes by both. Here we have wide isolated because of the punctuation that surrounds it and the fact that it was placed first in line 2. So there's nothing before it. All right, how can form and structure mirror content in poetry? Whenever you see a similarity between how a poem is formed and structured and what the poem is about, you are noticing form and structure mirroring content. So let's take a look at the poems we have already read and analyzed. Planting a Sequoia is about grieving the death of a deceased child through the planting of a tree. And this is mirrored through the regular structure of the poem. And what I mean by regular structure is the repeated structure. It's not unusual. It repeats, and there aren't a lot of strange, irregular line breaks and things that jump out at us as being strange for how it is structured. In terms of line lengths and where the punctuation is, we have the first 3 lines end stopped, and then we have one sentence broken in half with the enjambment just in line 4, and then the stanza end stopped. And then what's maybe even more regular about it is the repetition of this structure in the next stanza. So we have a similar kind of structure. We have a comma here. But even the line lengths are similar, where the 3rd line is longest in each stanza. Similar here, and similar here. This one is maybe the most different with this 3rd line seeming to have, for the 3rd line being a little bit shorter. But we have this regular structure of the poem that repeats a similar 5-line stanza structure in all 5 stanzas. And so the similarity between what the poem is about, the grieving, the death of a deceased child, and how it's written, is that in both there's this sort of sense of protection or safety, regularity, both in the memorial, because this tree is going to live forever, right? The tree's longevity, and the poem's regularity. We know what to expect. We know that this tree is still going to be alive even after all the other tragedies occur. The unborn brothers are going to die. The mother is not going to be beautiful anymore. She's going to die. The tree is still going to be there. Well, that same sort of sense of knowing what to expect is mirrored in the structure, in that we can expect the same format for each stanza, one stanza after the next. All right? All right, how about this one? While I wash my face, I ask impossible questions of myself and those who love me. This one is about a speaker questioning the meaning of their life. And that's reflected in all of the questions. So part of looking at form and structure is actually looking at how sentences are structured in the poem. And part of that is just looking at the type of sentences. So we've got questions, 8 of them. And I always, when I start looking at form and structure, I always just mark the punctuation marks just to kind of help me start thinking about this fact. Or if I see that there's a lot of question marks, I might just mark all the question marks a certain color and then other marks of punctuation in a different color. That's a helpful tip. How about in Flounder? Flounder is about a child learning about fishing and expectations of identity by watching and listening to their aunt. And this is mirrored again. It's reflected again in the repetition she said, which is isolated with commas. It's repeated in line 1, 23, and 25, highlighting the fact that it's what she said, it's what the aunt said that the speaker is remembering so much. All right, what are some key aspects when analyzing form and structure? Line lengths. Now, I'm going to ask you questions about this in the following activities, so I'm not going to get too detailed right this second. But looking at how long are the lines, how are some longer than others, are some shorter, are they all the same length? Visual appearance. So these are both really form, and just kind of looking at that larger silhouette. What is the overall visual appearance, and what do I notice that's interesting in terms of how this poem is formed? Then moving on to structure, what is the key focus of the poem? How is it organized? Is one stanza a lot different than another? Are some stanzas similar? How does it move from one stanza to the next, one line to the next? What are those transitions? Where are they? What are the changes? Sometimes there are transition words that are used. You can look for those. How are the stanzas similar and different? Are they similarly length, like in Planting a Sequoia, or are they differently lengthed? Are they, how much do they repeat one after the other? How different are they? What about syntax, types of sentences? What kinds of sentences are there? What kinds of marks of punctuation are there to help us determine this? Are there questions? Are there statements? End stopping and enjambment. This is key, right? What lines are end stopped? What lines are enjambed? What is the effect of that choice? And how does it affect the pacing? Enjambment actually makes a poem read faster because you only pause when you have punctuation. And if a lot of lines are enjambed, you may not have as much punctuation. And so that's actually going to make the lines go faster and make the pacing go faster. The more punctuation, the slower a poem is going to be because you have to pause at all those marks of punctuation. And so it is important to read it out loud. Which lines attract the most attention? Which lines are your eyes drawn to, maybe because they are so short or so long or isolated in some way because of marks of punctuation? Let's take a look at this poem, Disasters in the Eye of the Beholder, and I'll read the whole thing once. I used to live in a single wide, tilted on blocks in a dusty trailer park, or as the sign said to trucks that rumbled by, a much more respectable mobile home court. Thin pressboard panels hid a million roachy lives. Turning on the lights sent them fleeing back into the walls. Tiny feet patterned like rain, showers in retreat from the sun. I used to dream of a terrible storm, one to reach down with a dark, twisted arm and pick up those trailers, those non-mobile unhomes, crush them in a cloudy fist and scatter them like seeds across a plowed and fertile land. All right, let's take care of any words we maybe don't understand immediately, and then also do some SCSI. Single wide, what is a single wide? It's a type of trailer home or mobile home, usually 8 to 12 feet in width. Trailers are usually described as either single or double. So single is half the size of a double wide. Pressboard panels are maybe also something that you're not familiar with. These are manufactured wood that's cheaper, thinner, and not as long-lasting as wood. All right, let's talk setting. We have in stanza 1, the dusty trailer park described, where the speaker used to live in a single wide trailer tilted on blocks near a busy street that was named Mobile Home Park. In the second stanza, here we're inside the mobile home, aren't we? And we are looking at this sort of magnified level where there are roaches hiding when the light is turned on in the walls. In stanza 3, this is a more of a hypothetical kind of setting because this is a dream that's described that the speaker used to have of the trailer park being crushed and turned into seeds and then planted somewhere else. For character, we have the speaker who clearly doesn't like where they used to live, the trailer park. For the action, the poem is mostly a descriptive poem of where the speaker used to live and what they used to dream, right? But we have some action taking place, and sometimes just to determine what is actually happening, I might highlight or underline all of the verbs that you can find. So rumbled by, tilted, so you know that there's some action there. But again, this is really mostly about description, right? It's creating that setting. Even the roaches fleeing back into the walls is helping us understand the description of the interior of the mobile home. Maybe the most action is in the hypothetical third stanza where the storm reaches down. The storm is personified, right? And picks up the trailers and crushes them and scatters them. All right, S. Now we're going to move on to style. For this one, I want us to talk, instead of imagery, I want us to talk about structure and form. So for form, are certain lines much longer than others? Are certain lines much shorter than others? What effect do these choices have on the poem? Well, most lines are similarly lengthed, right? Maybe the 7th line and the 15th are the shortest. Mobile home court, from the sun. They're visually the shortest. They have the shortest number of words, and so those maybe are emphasized a little bit. How does the poem look visually on the page? Well, it looks similar. Maybe the one thing you notice is that the last stanza increases a little bit each line. It gets a little bit longer until we end the poem with line 24, the longest line of the poem. Did the author use a specific form, like an ode or a sonnet? Nah, not really. How does the form relate to content? Form often mirrors content. Do we know right now? I don't know. Maybe it's significant that this last stanza gets a little bit longer each line, because that's also the stanza where we have the most action happening. And so if you can start to put some of the pieces together when you find, literal, non-debatable things in the poem, that seem to kind of connect or work towards some kind of meaning, that's really beneficial. So we already talked about how there's the most action happening here in this last stanza. It also happens to be the stanza that has these lengthening lines, right? Well, let's pause there and move on to structure, and then maybe we can come back. What is the poet's focus of attention? How is it organized? You probably noticed we have a repetition of mobile home court, right, in line 7, and then it's again in line 21. Oh, my text got much smaller there. Sorry about that. But in line 21, it says those non-mobile unhomes. And so it's like a negated or negative version of mobile home court. It's non-mobile unhome. And so maybe there's a focus there. Transitions or changes, how is it divided up? Well, we notice that there are the 3 stanzas, and that in the first we have the general setting of the mobile home park. The second, we're on the interior of the mobile home park. And the third, we have this dream of destroying the mobile home park. Is there more than one stanza? Yeah, there are 3 stanzas. How are the stanzas organized? Do they relate to each other? I always count the number of lines. And if you do that in this poem, you'll find something kind of interesting. You'll find that the first stanza has 7 lines, the second has 8, and the last has 9. So each stanza increases in number of lines by 1. And that's similar to the last stanza that increases in line length, doesn't it? I had to enlarge these so you could kind of see that increase again. So, maybe there is something to this fact that things are getting longer. Maybe there's some momentum being created, and maybe the biggest, the most attention is on this last stanza. How about the structure of the lines and the sentences? Well, we do have some interesting structures. Marks of punctuation can be helpful. Here we have a colon. Whenever you see a colon, you want to look at what comes after the colon as being the most important. Think of it as an arrow. It is saying whatever follows the colon is more important. And so the speaker is saying thin pressboard panels hid a million Roshi lives, turning on the lights sent them fleeing back into the walls. The semicolon shows equity. It shows that there's equal emphasis between the two phrases. And so equal emphasis between turning on the lights sent them fleeing back into the walls and tiny feet patterned like rain showers in retreat from the sun. And then we also have this hyphen, double dash, M dash, call it what you will. It's a long hyphen, and it is showing that there is either a break or that we're talking about a phrase separate from the main structure of the sentence. And it usually shows an informal tone. And so this one is talking about this dream, right? The terrible storm. It's one to reach down with a dark twisted arm and pick up those trailers, da 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 da. So it's telling us more about the dream of a terrible storm. Now, maybe we can get somewhere with meaning, with the marks of punctuation. Maybe we can't, but it's good to understand what the marks of punctuation mean, okay? The examples of end stopping in Jammet and Sajura, I think, are interesting in this poem because we have, that interesting one we already talked about in stanza 1, and then we have, don't we have another one later? Oh, yeah, we have this one where we have the semicolon, and then we have the word tiny, and then feet patterned like rain, so that's kind of an unusual line break. And then if you notice, as we go on, there aren't any more of those really strange where there's just one word either at the end of a line. Oh, there's two right here, back and tiny. And then up here, remember, wide. So there aren't any of those in the last stanza. So once again, the last stanza seems to be a little bit different than the other two. The last stanza is much more regularly formatted in terms of line lengths and structure. And then how does the structure resemble the content? Maybe, once again, it's that, remembering the dream is a way to bring some, closure or some satisfaction to the speaker's bad memories. Early on, the odd lines, the short lines, the use of, these strangely punctuated lines gives us kind of an irregular feeling, an uncomfortable feeling, a feeling that the speaker is unsure or not enjoying thinking back to this trailer park. But by the end, we have more regularly formatted lines, maybe giving a sense of regularity, closure, something like that. Those things are appropriate things to argue in terms of our non-debatable, or in terms of our debatable and interpretive statements. All right, I've given you a few examples here of interpretive statements that you could make about this poem. Whenever you're making an interpretive statement in poetry, you have to be able to go back to something that is not interpretive, right? Something that's not debatable, something that's literal in the poem. And so I tried to do that within each interpretive statement. So the irregular line breaks, and I would explain how they're irregular line breaks, right, if I were arguing this, creates a disordered feeling that becomes more ordered as the poem continues. So the feeling that I'm saying it creates is the interpretive part, all right? The irregular line breaks, that's not debatable. There is a comma after the first word in line 2, right? How about the next one? Each stanza is one line longer than the last, which builds momentum as the poem continues. How about this one? The 3-word sentence at the end of stanza 1 visually isolates the words mobile home court, which emphasizes the irony of the name of the park. unnamed in line 21 because it's really the opposite, right? They're not mobile. They don't move anywhere, and they're not very good homes. How about this one? The three-word sentence in line 15 visually isolates the words from the sun, emphasizing the feeling of hiding from the sun, which connects to the coming storm in stanza 3. I don't know. Those are some possible interpretive statements about this poem. You're going to do the same thing for the next poem. Tackle the form and structure of Hanging Fire and answer those questions in your packet, and then we'll talk about this poem together in our Hub Huddle. Thanks, guys.